Alright, hi, this is Mr. Kestel. This is a video about the fuel systems for aviation. I'm going to be covering information that is on this worksheet here. If you look at your PowerPoint, there's a whole lot more information. I'm just going to be covering the information that's on here. I'm not going to tell you exactly how to fill out the worksheet precisely. But you should be able to figure out based on what I talk about. Also, if you're looking for particular things, I will put timestamps in the description so you can look there. There will also be links to the other videos related to this assignment. So here we go. So getting us started is a checklist. Pre-flight checklist for a Cessna 172, and since this is about fueling systems, where it tells you to write down the items that are related to fuel. So we're only worried about the things that are related to fuel. I'm not going to tell you exactly which ones to check, but if it says fuel in it, then that's something that we need to look at. Also, notice it says if there are items repeated more than once on the checklist, and this only occurs when you have the left and right side, you only have to include them on the table one time. So the right wing and the left wing have the same exact things on them, so we only have to look at one of the wings. Alright, so now I'm going to go ahead and assume you figured out which things on the checklist are related to fuel, and so we'll go ahead and look at those different concepts. Alright, so I figured I'd make this nice little intro slide here, and the first actual two things that we're going to look at, they're not right next to each other, but there's two different things listed, are the fuel quantity and then fuel quantity indicators. So, looking at the fuel quantity indicator, this part of the checklist is in the cockpit, and it tells how much fuel is in each tank. It could be measured in gallons or in pounds, but usually in gallons if you're in a small plane. You only have to be completely accurate for if the tank is empty. So obviously it's good to know if you're getting close to empty, but that's what we got to do. So you just want to make sure that there's fuel, that the indicator is indicating that there's fuel in the tank. And sometimes they do have indicators that tell you how quickly the fuel is being used. So if you are checking the quantity on the wing, you want to visually check the tank for that there's fuel in it, and you want to check the color of the fuel, which we will get into. But different fuels have different colors. They're dyed different colors to make sure you are using the right fuel for your airplane. All right, next we have the fuel selector valve. The fuel selector is the part in the cockpit that decides where you are getting your fuel. Since many planes store their fuel in the wings, you might most of the time you've got a selector that has left, right, off, or both. So if you are just using the left, then the engine's only going to use fuel from the left side. If you've got it turned to right, it's only going to use fuel from the right side. And if you have it selected both, it'll use both. You want to make sure that you're balanced in how much fuel you're using from left to right. You don't want to have a situation where your left wing has a bunch of fuel and your right side has very little. Otherwise, it's gonna, the left side is gonna be heavier than the right side, and that'll make it harder to control the plane. Um, so typically in takeoff, it's set to both because you want to make sure you have plenty of fuel. But they're not guaranteed that you're going to get equally usage because that has to do with the fuel pumps and the way that the fuel is guided to the engine. So on our checklist, since fuel selector valve is supposed to be set to both, then you would want to make sure that your selector is pointing at the both. All right, so now fuel tank sump drain valves. So a fuel tank has these parts called a fuel sump. That's the lowest part of the fuel tank. So contaminants in the fuel will naturally sink to the bottom because they are denser or heavier than the fuel itself. So a sump is a place, there will be a drain on it, and at those places you're going to drain, you're going to open it up and drain out the contaminants from the fuel tank. And you're going to keep draining it until you don't have any signs of contamination. So maybe it looks, at first when you drain it, it looks cloudy or watery, and then you start draining it a little bit more, and you end up with the same color for the fuel. So for instance, one of the fuels is like a light blue color, so you're going to drain it until you get a light blue color coming out of it. So that's the purpose of the sumps and drains. It's one thing. It's part of one thing, and so that allows you to make sure that your fuel that you're using is not contaminated. If it's contaminated, then it could mess up the engine, and you don't want that to happen while you're in the sky. So again, your bit to do is to drain each tank sump. You're going to check, make sure there's no contaminants, and it smells, and the smell is right, the color's right. And if you're not sure about the type of fuel, you don't depart. You don't want to get up in the sky and have the wrong kind of fuel in there. So that's what your job is for that. All right, so we've got a fuel filler cap. A fuel filler is the opening where you fill the tank. So nothing more complicated than that. So usually the fuel tanks are on the wings. So depending on the plane, you may need a ladder or something to get up to it. But they have a cap on it, and you want to make sure it is covered by that cap. You don't forget to put the cap back on. If you leave the cap off, then some of the fuel could leak out, or you could get things inside the fuel tank while you're flying, and obviously that's not things that we want to have happen. If there's a vent, then you want to keep that clear so that the air pressure inside the tank is proper and good. Sometimes the fuel can expand and you get some pressure inside the fuel tank, and so you want to make sure there's vents that allow the fuel tank to be at the optimal setting. And again, so your guideline is to ensure the caps are secure. That you're going to check that, and you're going to make sure, because if you don't check that, if a cap comes off, fuel can siphon out. That just means that it can leak out at a very fast rate, and you do not want to be flying without any fuel. All right, next is the fuel strainer drain valve. So a strainer is typically, we use that to, like if you're making noodles, you put the noodles and the water into the strainer, and that keeps all of your noodles, and you could discard all your water. Or if you're like me, you just use a fork. So a fuel strainer is going to the fuel will pass through it, and it will screen out, filter out the debris, moisture, dirt, all that kind of stuff. So the sump valve did that naturally by in the fuel tank, but this is on the way to from the fuel tank to the carburetor to the engine. So there's a drain located on the belly of the aircraft, and you're just going to make sure that you drain that. You don't want to get the strainer filled up and not be able to strain out any more fuel or any more contaminants, because then those contaminants will go straight into the engine. So that's part of the pre-flight check, is to just make sure that the strainer is drained of any of the contaminants from the fuel line. All right, so as I alluded to earlier, there are a couple types of fuel depending on the aircraft. A turbine engine uses jet fuel, whereas a reciprocating engine or internal combustion, like the one in smaller planes, will use aviation gas, which is called AV gas. And they're each color-coded, as I also mentioned earlier, to make sure you don't use the wrong type of gas. So, jet fuel, which is used in a turbine or a jet engine, is kerosene based. Kerosene is one of the things that are a byproduct of when you refine oil. So you get kerosene and gasoline and all sorts of different fuels are made when in a oil distillery. So they add some coloring. Well, sometimes it's clear or it's straw colored, which is like a yellowish color, kind of like down here at the bottom, this yellow bar. So when it says it has a higher flash point than gasoline-based fuels, that means it takes a higher temperature to make it burn. So you definitely do not want to put this into a reciprocating engine or a small plane and small engine plane, because that will mess your engine will not be able to handle that fuel. AV gas is mostly gasoline based. They do some different things with it. The octane level kind of determines how well it runs in your engine. That's really a simplified version of it. But if you go to a gas station, you'll notice the numbers on the at the gas pump, like 88, 98, 108, things like that. Those are called the octane of the gas. And so most of the time it uses 100 octane gas for aviation. And the biggest point thing here is that it's pale blue color. So when you're doing those gasoline checks, or you're using the sump drain, you're going to be looking for that light blue color. And so that's that. All right, last but not least are some fueling guidelines. We've already really gone through several of these. I noted them several points in time, like this one slide had several guidelines for it. There's some other guidelines that you can you want to make sure that you're following. So when you order the gasoline, not gasoline, but the gas, the fuel, you're going to want to make sure that you get the right amount of fuel, and the right type of fuel. So you're going to double check that if you're filling up the aircraft. The nozzle will be different depending on the type of fuel. They do that on purpose. So if you're getting, and you can even see on this jet fuel one, it says jet fuel right on the side. So try to make like lots and lots of different ways to ensure that you're getting the right type of fuel. Also, when you are fueling, you're going to want to ground it. So grounding means that any buildup of electrons or charges on the metal part of the plane will go down into the ground and not accumulate. If you took physics, you probably learned about static electricity, or you've just experienced that. If you had a bunch of charges built up on the metal part of the plane and you get a little spark while you're fueling the plane, then that's going to cause those things to catch on fire, and that's a problem. So you want to avoid that. So you always ground your plane while fueling. So and the pumps and trucks, they'll have this built up a thing for that. So it's not like you have to figure it out all out yourself. It's just a step that you need to follow in the process of fueling. All right, so that does it. You should have enough information to complete this entire worksheet, and I hope you have a wonderful day full of laughter and joy.